by Allison to tell us about the computational assumption by linear and multilinear maps.
Thank you. So this isn't my day job anymore. So you'll have to forgive me for not being as up to date with the latest assumptions that were probably posted yesterday while I was making these slides. It's just going to be a little outdated. We're going to go back all the way to 2001 in terms of crypto years. It's like 70 years. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the framework that I use, sort of organizing all the different kinds of assumptions that we use on bilinear maps and multilinear maps and how they relate to one another, and also show you a little bit about how we use them in proofs, because of course it's how they get used in proofs that drives how we make these assumptions. So going back to the very basic beginnings, for this talk, and we're going to use the multiplicative group notation. So what this means is we have a cyclic group generated by G. And please feel free to ask me questions during the talk. So if I'm losing you in the math notation, please let me know. And we will get to a point where there's no more numbers on the slides and there's only colors. So have to bear with me until we get there. So for now, we're going to have a cyclic group. It's always going to be generated by G. We're looking at the exponents. The group operation is multiplicative. So that corresponds to adding the exponent. And we'll write all of our assumptions this way. So the fundamental landscape of what we hope for in terms of hardness in these groups is we have a few things we need to be efficient, like the group operation and the identity test, which also referred to as the zero test, because we zero in the exponent would be the multiplicative identity. And we really hope what's inefficient is at least the discrete log assumption. That's kind of the basic premise. The trouble, of course, happens with all the space in the middle. And this landscape of assumptions corresponds to sort of drawing different shapes of what we imagine the space between these efficient operations and these inefficient operations is going to be. Of course, the most extreme version of that is if we sort of collapse the gray space down to these known efficient operations, which is what the generic group model corresponds to. Where the only things that are efficient are these explicit operations that we've allowed. So bilinear groups is a very similar phenomenon, except we have one more operation that we declare to be efficient, which is the pairing E here, which is a one-time multiplication in the exponent. And it lands you in a new group so that it's not repeatable. So it essentially corresponds to slightly redrawing these boundaries of the known efficient operations to include this one multiplication in the exponent. And we have just as rich a space of choices as for what we assume is inefficient around this. And of course, we have the same option of making a generic group model where we suppose that everything else essentially is inefficient. And of course, we're constantly faced with new group assumptions in bilinear groups. So the first question we always want to know, is this a reasonable assumption? Is this something we can rely on for cryptography? I actually find this question mostly uninteresting, because most of these assumptions are introduced as intermediary paths as we mature our proof techniques in order to get down to more standard assumptions. So the history of bilinear map cryptography has very much been that the first time you propose a system, you have a generic group proof. The second time you propose a system, you have a Q-type assumption, which I'll show you. Third time you propose a system, you got to have a static assumption, and the fourth time it's finally an SXTH or something of that nature. So, in my opinion, we shouldn't really be as concerned about the status of the security of these assumptions in the middle if we view them as theoreticians and don't pitch to them to practitioners as like ready to be implemented now. But if we view them as theoreticians as sort of useful steps in understanding our proof methodology and getting down to more basic assumptions. So what I'm going to show you kind of in this hierarchy is how we end up using these different levels of assumptions and how the proof techniques sort of matured along with that process along the way. So the basic kinds of assumptions in this space, we start with generic group models, and then we have Q-type assumptions, and then we have static assumptions. And for each one of these categories, you have a bunch of other variants, whether the groups are symmetric or asymmetric, whether the groups are composite order or prime order, whether the group is linear, bilinear, or multilinear. All these things, all these hierarchies sort of function analogously under all these different choices of these attributes. And we can pretty much match up the history of proof techniques along with these kind of assumptions. We can have a very brute force proof technique, which corresponds to using generic group arguments, and I'll show you guys a basic example of that. We have cancellation techniques, which gives us selective security for things like the phony boy and ID. We have encoding techniques, which use Q-type assumptions. And then more recently, dual system and déjà Q techniques, which use more static assumptions to get results that we previously needed to use higher things in the assumption hierarchy for. So just to give you a flavor of what these sort of the gold standard assumptions look like. So at the end of the day, we want to target very concrete, easy to state, easy to study assumptions like this one. So this is a bilinear Diffie-Hellman assumption. Essentially says, okay, we've got this new one-time multiplication in the exponent that's declared to be efficient, but a 3-time multiplication in the exponent through a cubic term should be difficult. So the assumption is that if I give you these group elements G, G to the X, G to the Y, G to the Z, it should be difficult to distinguish something that has this, this degree 3 term in the exponent from something that's random. And so throughout this talk, I'm going to use R as an exponent. That's always just represents a random, uniformly random exponent in the space. Okay. A very similar assumption that we can make if we have asymmetric groups. So notice here, we have a symmetric group. The pairing takes 2 elements in the same group into a new group. We change that, and we take an element of G and an element of a different group H. We can make an even simpler assumption called the SXPH assumption, where we have generators of each group, we have G to the A and G to the B, and now we can declare it to be difficult to distinguish G to the A times B from G to the R. So notice here that this pairing operation only allows you to multiply something in G and something in H in the exponent, and does not allow you to multiply 2 things from the same group, which is why it's plausible in these settings that this quadratic term in the exponent A times B is still difficult. Sorry?
Is it G to the G to the B or G to the H to the B? You don't use that H. It's not the H.
This is just standard DDH on one side of the parent. So, I mean, your variant would probably also if I had H to the B there, then this would be insecure. Because I could take G to the A and H to the B, and I could pair them, and I could compare that to G to the AB paired with H. So it needs to be all on one side. And there's a symmetry here between the sides. I can also implicitly relabel G as H and H as G, so I'm assuming that the typical Diffie-Hellman problem, G to the A, G to the B, and then distinguishing G to the AB from random, I'm assuming that's hard on one side of the group, because within that group I don't have a pairing. And I can symmetrically analogously assume, just by renaming, that it's also hard on the other side. So I could have written here G, H, H to the A, H to the B. So I'm simultaneously assuming it on each side individually, but I can't cross over. If I gave you G to the A and H to the B, then you'd be able to pair those and distinguish. Other questions? Okay. And so the nice thing about these static assumptions is if I want to know at least does it hold in the generic security model, if I write down some potentially complicated sequence of exponents here, and I want to know is this at least under generic security a reasonable assumption, I can by brute force come up with all the different exponents that you can make as combinations of these things, at least in terms of, every exponent that you can make here by following the rules is going to be a linear combination of terms that you can make from doing these one-time pairings. All right, so you can understand sort of as an algebraic object the set of exponents that I can create here by sort of following the rules. And you can brute force check that this G to the A times B is not in the span of those terms that you can get from doing these allowed operations. So this is what I call kind of like a brute force proof. So we can brute force prove things in the generic group model, including things like that this assumption at least is generically secure. So against an adversary who only follows the rules of doing the efficient operations that we've given him, this assumption is going to hold. Okay? And so to give you a sense of how these things start getting a little more complicated, this is what a basic Q-type assumption looks like. So we're going to go back to a symmetric group, and all these things have versions, both symmetric and asymmetric. But just for simplicity, we'll do a symmetric group. I can give you exponents like g to the s, g to the a, g to the a squared, g to the a cubed, all the way up to g to the a to the q, where q is some parameter that might have something to do with the scheme that I'm trying to prove something about. And I'm going to declare that it's difficult to distinguish the pairing with an exponent of s times a to the q plus 1 from a random exponent. And so now, there's a parameterized number of terms, but if I stare at this for long enough, I can sort of convince myself, like, how would I get to an s times a to the q plus 1 in the exponent? Well, I definitely need to use s, right? There's only one s up there, so I would need to use g to the s. And now I can only pair it against one thing, right? My pairing only lets me do multiplication of two things. So I need to pair it essentially against a to the q plus 1. And I don't have that as an individual term. I only have that if I've already performed a pairing. And if I've already performed a pairing to get to the a to the q plus 1, then I don't have space to put the s in. And so with these kind of assumptions, you can still sort of reason your way through, even though I can't, in some sense, brute force check anymore because q is a parameter, so it makes it arbitrarily large. I can still reason about the fact that this exponent is something I can't achieve by following the rules on the elements that I've given. Of course, the intended value of these assumptions is to get beyond the world where we assume an adversary follows the rules. And what we're able to do with this is we're able to show that an adversary has to break something like specific, like this problem, which we can then study in order to break our system. So we think of this sort of checking that the assumption is generically secure is really just a sanity check. But ultimately, of course, we want to get to assumptions that we study more independently and more conclusively than that to base our systems on. So a driving example, if you want to see kind of how these different classes of assumptions are used differently in proofs, so we'll go back to the classic example of the Bilinear identity-based encryption scheme. So if there anybody in here who hasn't seen identity-based encryption, the main idea is that secret keys and ciphertexts are encrypted and given to a particular identity. So, so this person has this particular identity baked into their key, and they're going to be able to decrypt the ciphertext. The intent is, if and only if, the identity match. So if the ciphertext is encrypted to that same identity. And so there are some public parameters of the system that everybody gets to know. It's a public system, so anyone can encrypt. So you encrypt the message n by multiplying it by this e.g. to the alpha. You choose your own randomness s. So you put your own encryption randomness s in there. You can also create g to the s. And to express this identity that you're encrypting to, you compute g to the s times aid plus b, which you can do as a function of these public parameters here. And to create a secret key, so somebody who knows the master secret key alpha here as an exponent, can create these secret keys, and they put in a little bit of randomness for each key that they create. So they form this exponent alpha plus r times aid plus b, and they also give you g to the r. So if you are the person whose identity matches the intended recipient of the ciphertext, then you can simply perform these two pairings. So you pair g to the s against g to the alpha plus r aid plus b, and you get this s alpha term, which is what you want in order to unmask the message. And then you get this extra term that comes along and personalizes this to your identity. Okay, so this idea is coming from the key here interacting with the ciphertext. And now, if the identity that it was encrypted to matches the same, that same ID, then you can get rid of this extra stuff that came along by doing this pairing of this g to the r in your key with this additional ciphertext term, and these guys are going to perfectly cancel out, and you're going to get this blinding factor that you need to reveal the message. And the idea here is that if your identity doesn't match, then you'll have something different here that won't cancel out, and you won't be able to decrypt. But of course, in arguing security, we need to do a better job than just saying the same algorithm for decryption doesn't work. So let's start with the very basic notion of generic security. So the goal there is to say that this blinding factor of the message is something that you can't obtain from just doing the allowed efficient operations on the group given the group elements that you've been given as part of the ciphertext and any keys that don't match that identity. So whenever we're doing generic group arguments, we can pull everything out of the exponent and just look at it this way and say these are essentially the things that you're given, and the rules are you can do one-time multiplications and you can do linear combinations, but that's it. So you can't create any cubic terms, for instance. So these exponents that you're given, so from the public parameters, you're given A and B, meaning that you're given to the A and G of the B, you're given this S in the ciphertext. Let's say the ciphertext is encrypted to this identity star. So you get this combination S times A ID star plus B. And then if you're given a bunch of keys, let's say for a Q different identities, then you're going to have Q different pairs of elements that look like this, like alpha plus R1 times AID1 plus B and R1 and so on. You know, these Q different pairs. And we're going to suppose here that you're not a legitimate recipient of this message, so none of these identities match the identity star in the ciphertext. And so in this case, if you sort of play around with all the different terms that you can make by doing the pairing, all you can do is get linear combinations of terms that are individually of degree at most 2, and you're trying to arrive at this blinding factor, which is alpha S, that's blinding the ciphertext. And so you can sort of see that you better start with an alpha times S, right? The only way to get alpha and S is to multiply alpha times something with S in it. So if you choose this S here, you get this extra stuff that comes along. You don't have this matching term to get rid of it. Same thing happens if you choose this S over here. It's got this matching ID star stuff. You just have no way of subtracting from the space of terms that you employ. And so, so we can play around with schemes like this, and we can argue that there's no way to get this blinding factor alone when ID star is not equal to any of these individual identities. Yes?
What happens if several users collude, try to match the identity?
Yeah, so that's what this model is right here. So let's say users with identities ID1, ID2.
Star is the one.
Yeah, so ID star is the, so that's why, so for instance, if I didn't have this plus B right here, then you might worry about somebody having an identity that's like maybe 2 times ID star or something. But yeah, but we are also allowing for that and still arguing is secure. Other questions about this? Okay. So with that kind of argument, we can convince ourselves that at least against an adversary who follows all the rules of using only the allowed efficient group operations, he can collude, he can ask for as many identity keys as he wants. As long as he doesn't have the identity that we encrypt to, he won't be able to distinguish the blinding factor from random, and therefore our message will be safe. So the challenge starts when we try to go beyond generic security. Right? So we'd like to say a much stronger statement. We'd like to say as long as discrete log is hard, the system is secure. Right? Nobody knows how to do that for identity-based encryption. So we'd like to get closer to things like at least as long as bilinear Diffie-Hellman is hard, this scheme is secure. And so the fundamental challenge of creating proofs like this is that we have to create a simulator that balances two things that are very much in tension. He has to solve this hard problem, so whether it be bilinear Diffie-Hellman or SXCH, but he also has to give the attacker all these keys for all these potential colluding identities. So the attacker may ask for a bunch of different identities, and the simulator needs to be able to produce what the attacker wants, and yet he needs to leverage the attacker's success into solving the hard problems. So this is always a balance between the simulator needs to be powerful enough to answer all the valid attacker queries that he gets, but he also needs to not be too powerful, because if he simply knows the master secret of the system, then he can't really leverage the attacker's success. The attacker is telling him something he doesn't already know. And so the balance, one way to balance these two things is to embed this challenge problem as a function of a known target identity. So the notion of selective security came about by saying it's easier to balance these two goals if we know ahead of time where this challenge identity that we shouldn't know the key for, where that's going to be. So we imagine a world in which the attacker declares in the very beginning, I want to encrypt messages. I want to decrypt messages encrypted to this particular challenge ID, and the simulator is going to use that knowledge in designing the system. And so, so for this, we can give a proof from the bilinear Diffie-Hellman assumption here. So we imagine our simulator is given these elements g, g to the x, g to the y, g to the z, and his goal is to distinguish this cubic term, the exponent, from random. And he's going to set up the system by choosing this master secret alpha to be something he doesn't know, right? If he knew the master secret, he could break all the encryption himself, and the attacker wouldn't be doing any work. So he's going to choose it to be x times y, which he doesn't know. He's going to choose the encryption randomness to be z, and he's going to embed this knowledge of where the attacker is going to attack into his choice of the public parameters. So he's going to choose these parameters a to be x and b to be negative x id star plus w. And you'll see why in a moment and why that is a meaningful choice. So this is just to show that with these choices, he can create these public parameters, which he used to be able to give to the attacker, as a function of these group elements that he has. And he can create the ciphertext also as a function of these group elements that he has. So notice here that when we're multiplying s by this function aid plus b, if s has this unknown z in it, and a and b have this unknown x in it, we don't actually know how to produce g to the z times x. So we have to set this up so that it cancels out. So that when we have aid star plus b, the x term cancels out at this one particular place and allows us to create g to the s times that value. And so we're embedding this cancellation so that there's this one property of this function, aid star plus b. The x drops out at exactly this one place where we need to create this challenge ciphertext. Similarly, when we're creating a key, we know that the key must be for an identity that's not equal to id star, which means that this difference is non-zero, and hence we can divide by it, and we can set it up so that this alpha here, this x times y, and the alpha that we don't know, is going to cancel out with an x times y term coming from this aid plus b combination. Okay, so the higher level point here is that knowing where the attacker is going to attack gives us an ability to sort of take this challenge problem and put it in exactly the right place so that we can make a ciphertext for this challenge identity, and we can make keys for any other identity, but not this id star. Okay, so knowing that kind of information ahead of time gives us a better way to embed our problem so that we can create all these other keys. And so here the simulator can produce a key for any identity not equal to id star. And hence, when the attacker breaks our encryption for this one challenge identity, he must be distinguishing this blinding factor of the message from a random value. So he's solving this bilinear Diffie-Hellman problem. Okay, so this gives us a proof of selective security from one of these fixed assumptions that we can study.
It's a different R, sorry. I mean, this is R from the secret generation, not the R from challenge. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm using R. I'm overusing R for multiple things.
So the simulator will just choose random R. He doesn't know R prime. He just chooses random R.
Yeah. So the simulator is supposed to. So I used R as we go back. I used R here in the system as part of the randomness and key generation. And I'm just saying that the simulator at that point will he'll pick his own R prime. And he'll implicitly set R to be this function of y, which he doesn't know, and the identities, and then that'll work out so that this thing that he's supposed to make in the key won't have this alpha in it, which he can't produce.
Oh, so he doesn't actually need to compute RW, he needs to compute G to the RW.
Yeah, he needs to compute G to the RW, and R has a y in it, but that's okay, it's not quadratic, right? So we can take G to the y in it. But that is completely different from this R and overusing R. So R always means randomness, and I'm not going to stick to one particular meaning. So this is not a collision resistant Other questions about this before we move on?
What happens if you just assume an ID star?
Sorry?
Can you just like randomly pick an ID star and hope for the best?
Excellent question. Which brings me to our next question. What if we don't want to fix ID star ahead of time? So one approach would be for the simulator to guess, right? So the simulator guesses where the attacker is going to attack. What is the chance, what is the probability of that guess being correct? It's 1 over the number of identities, right? So if we're going with an exponential, let's say, space of possible identities, in this case, the identity can be any element of the finite field, that is the exponent space, which is typically going to be exponentially large in the security parameter. So the chance of him successfully guessing that would be negligible under this parameter setting. If you're in a situation where you're guessing among a polynomial number of things, then that would be quite reasonable to do. But it would limit us to identity spaces that were polynomial. And in general, we don't accept that limitation if not necessary. Other questions about this? Okay. So what if we don't want to fix ID star ahead of time, and we don't want to accept the huge hit in the success probability that would come from correctly guessing something in a large identity space? Well, one approach is to say, well, we're not going to guess exactly the identity. We don't really have to guess it exactly, because we're not going to be required to make all of the exponentially many possible keys for other identities. The attacker is only allowed to ask polynomially many queries. So in some sense, we could try to create a world where there's some portion of keys that we can't make, and there's some portion of keys that we can make. And we can hope that, and let's say we make this portion of keys that we can't make roughly 1 over q, a proportion of the entire identity space, where q is the number of queries the attacker is going to make. So ultimately, he's going to ask for q things, where q is a polynomial, and he's going to attack with one thing. So if we kind of divide the space into this 1 over q proportion of things we can't make, and he asks for q things, and we have to hope they land in the blue, and then he attacks this one thing, and we have to hope it lands in the red, now we have a polynomial chance, or 1 over polynomial chance of those hopes simultaneously holding. Assuming that, from the attacker's perspective, we need to just make everything look random. So it's a little misleading because it's got some structure, of course, to the set, but assume it's kind of distributed uniformly at random among everything else. Okay, then we would have a polynomial chance of succeeding. But now we have the question of how do we sort of encode, how do we sort of create this key space so that there's this set of things we can make and this set of things we can't make. So the technique I just showed you of having things cancel out is a very high precision technique, right? Like something either cancels or it doesn't. There's going to be one place where it cancels in a linear function. So, and the answer to this, sort of philosophically, was to create this parameterized space in the assumption. So this was an original use of Q-type assumptions, where if your assumption itself has a sort of Q-many terms, then you can use that assumption to encode and create a key space where you have a set of roughly 1 over Q of things that you can't produce in it, and the other set of things you can. So I'm not going to go into the details of this because we get us a little bit off track. But the sort of philosophy is I need to encode a parameterized amount of information. This parameter Q needs to be reflected somehow in my public parameters. So putting it in an assumption and then putting the assumption into the parameters is sort of one way of sort of pushing the encoding problem into the assumption, which is how we got Q-type assumptions as a useful object that we're driving security groups. But since then, of course, there's been an interesting line of work of trying to take things that we know how to do with Q-type assumptions or know how to do with generic security proofs and slowly whittling them down to get back to base assumptions like the symmetric external Diffie-Hellman or DLN, which is the symmetric group version of that. And part of it relies not just on changes to schemes and sort of ad hoc adjustments to these proof techniques, but what's starting to arise out of this is some systematic simulation paradigms for simulating some effects of Q-type assumptions using these assumptions in the middle, which are composite order subgroup decision. And on a similar vein, there are techniques being built for simulating effects of these composite order subgroup decision assumptions with these more standard Diffie-Hellman type assumptions. Yeah, so I'm going to show you a little bit about what these abstract techniques for working on these assumptions are. And then actually plugging these things into systems is itself also a rich and varied area of research, because these simulation techniques at present are so brittle, in fact, that these arrows are not even transited. So the techniques that are used up here in the Deja Q space use stronger properties of these middle assumptions than can be simulated by these current techniques on the other end. Okay, and so to show you what these useful objects in the middle look like, I'm going to show them in terms of color. So every row here is always going to be a group element. And so I want you to imagine this is a group that has three pieces to it. So every single group element has a blue piece, a red piece, and a green piece. And they all operate independently. So blue only interacts with blue, red only interacts with red, and green only interacts with green. And this is what the exponents, this is how the exponents behave. So imagine I have this exponent A in the blue space, and C in the red space, and D in the green space. And if I just give you an element, a group element, all these things are tied together. So you're not able to sort of separate them out. So they're operating separately, but they're sort of tied together in your view of them, so you can't sort of pull them apart. And so how the pairing operates is sometimes, of course, I might have a 0 exponent in one of these spaces. And so I'm just going to leave the color off in that case, and it's going to implicitly be 0. But when I pair something that looks like this with something that has this missing red part, then only the blue and green parts come out of the pairing. So on the other side of the pairing, I have a similar group that also has 3 parts. And what it does is it individually multiplies the exponents in the blue space, so I get an A times B exponent here. It individually multiplies the exponents in the green space, so I get a D times F here. And here it's doing the same thing, it's just multiplying C by 0. So whenever I have a gap, that gap propagates throughout the pairing process. Okay, so this is structurally how composite order bilinear groups work. Any questions about that?
So all 3 groups are the same order still?
No, they're actually going to be, or each one is a prime. So it's going to be like prime P, prime Q, prime W. And those primes will be different. So by Chinese remainder theorem, we're going to have some information theoretic.
Oh, sorry, I meant vertically.
Yes, so vertically, each group is of order P times Q times W, or something like that. Yes. Any other questions? Okay. So let me tell you what assumptions look like in this space. So here's a particularly useful subgroup decision assumption. And here, instead of using R as a random exponent, just when I don't write an exponent, assume it to be random. Okay? So I'm going to give you a random element that has a blue part and a red part, but no green part. And you know the structure of what you're given. So you can't pull it apart, but you know, I just told you this first element has blue and red. And so you can't pull it apart and see them, but you know that they're there. You know that green is not there. I'm going to give you a blue generator that has nothing else on it. I'm going to give you a green generator that has nothing else on it. I'm going to give you a combination of red and green. And now I'm going to ask you to distinguish something random from all 3 spaces, or subspaces, from something that is missing this red part. Okay. So let's think about the kind of operations that you can do. So going back to this generic group mindset of just playing around with all the things you know you're allowed to do and see if you can distinguish these things. So if you're going to distinguish something, on its own it looks pretty random, right? So we're going to have to pair it with something else. If I pair it with anything like this blue guy on its own, right, it would kill the interaction of the red anyway. If I pair it against something that has no red, the red won't have an effect. It'll get multiplied by 0. And there's no way I'm going to see a difference between these 2 things if I kill the interaction of the only space where they differ. Right? So it's pretty much only going to be useful to pair these two possibilities against something that has red. Okay, because it's the only way in which they differ. So if I pair them against this guy that's red and green, well, in both cases I just get a random green. So I can't see the difference between those two things. And if I pair it against this guy that has red and blue, then in both cases I just get a random blue. And I can't tell the difference between a random blue and a random blue and red. Okay, so I would have to get something that's either the identity element or not the identity element in order to distinguish these two things. Okay, because in general, if I'm just looking at an element that's random in some combination of these subspaces, I can't tell you which ones are there or not. I can only tell you if I see that it's 0 across the board or not. Okay, any questions about this? Okay, but so somebody tell me, is this assumption still true if I could pair three things, if I had a trilinear map? If I could multiply three elements at once and I had the same semantics of, that zeros propagate and non-zeros remain non-zeros when they're all multiplied together, would this assumption still be true if I could put together three things at a time instead of two? No, right? Does everybody see the attack? So let's say I'm in this case where I have all three of these, and I pair it against red and green. Okay, in that case, the blue gets killed, and I just have something that's red and green. And now I pair it against red and blue, and now only the red would survive. So if I had started that process with this guy with no red, I would get all zeros, and I get the identity element. Whereas if I start that process with this guy, I end up with reds, and then I can distinguish. Any questions about this? Yeah?
What if they were in the target group, then you can't pair, right? The elements you're distinguishing. Even then, would trilinear map help?
So a trilinear map, if I had like an asymmetric trilinear map, and I controlled that I couldn't actually do that combination of things, right? Then it could still potentially be secure. But in anything that allows me to combine, this challenge element with both this red and green and this blue and red, any group that allows me to look at all those three things at the same time, this is going to be insecure, at least as I've written it. Okay. So what does this look like in a multilinear group? It starts to be fun to actually make these into patterns. I'm not a very geometric thinking person, but there must be also just like an entirely different language of tiling or something that encapsulates which of these assumptions are secure or not. But if we look at something like, so I'm just saying if any group that allows you to do those three things, this particular assumption is not secure. So if we wanted to create an assumption that remains secure in a three-linear group, we can just start brute force adding more colors. Okay, so here's a combination that remains secure in a three-linear group. And so a three-linear group I need here, I can take any three things and essentially multiply them together in the exponent. So what you're going to see here is, okay, I'm trying to distinguish something with all the colors from something with only three of the colors. And if you played around with this for long enough, you would convince yourself that, okay, if I'm going to see the difference between these two things, I somehow need to cancel the red, the green, and the purple. I need to get rid of all those three are kind of blinding factors obscuring this difference in the blue. And so if I want to get rid of red, I have to pair against something that's missing red. But all the things that are missing red still have green and purple. So I've already wasted now two things into my product of three things just to get rid of red. And now if I want to get rid of green, I have to pair against something that doesn't have green, but all the things that don't have green still have purple. And vice versa, if I pair against something that doesn't have purple, it still has green. So there's no way to cancel out all three of these spaces by pairing this against two other things. Yes?
So are all the red blocks supposed to be the same group element or like independently random ones?
Independently random ones. So every time I don't put a exponent in here, I mean it's an independently fresh random.
So these are very different in flavor from like the Diffie-Hellman stuff.
Very different in flavor, yes. More randomness. Any other questions about this? Okay, so you can imagine the temptation as a theoretician writing these kind of proofs. I can do this all day, right? I can come up with all kinds of different versions of these things that are generically secure. So most of what's interesting about this area is trying to whittle these things down and simulate them from the most basic and most trusted assumptions that we can. So, but this has become a very nice, at least in the bilinear setting, and go back to this assumption. There's a lot of dual system full security proofs that are very conceptually simple to write down in this framework, and then can be holistically translated into proofs from symmetric external Diffie-Hellman and Dlin. So this has served as a very useful sort of intermediary stage of making sort of clear what's happening in sort of the high-level proof technology, which is sort of working on top of this framework, and then what's happening in the underlying mathematics to emulate these features and sort of separating that out. And so part of our hope in this area of research is that something similar will happen in multilinear groups. At the moment, and again, there's probably an ePrint like within this talk that I don't yet know about. But at the moment, the state as I know it is that we have been very successful at building things, again, from this kind of framework in multilinear groups, but we don't yet have candidates for how to instantiate these assumptions in ways that we think are secure on multilinear maps. Is that correct? You're not e-printing right now? Something else? Okay. All right. So I'm sort of going to show you more about how to use this framework and how to simulate these features under the hood from these more basic assumptions. And also, what's interesting is on the other side, this is a framework that allows us to simulate Q-type assumptions. So if we think of trying to get an assumption that has these Q terms down to something that has a constant number of terms, and these techniques of Deja Q use this kind of framework to simulate the features of these Q-type assumptions with these types of decision assumptions. I should have put a citation here. So this is work over the last few years by Melissa Chase, Sarah Mickeljohn, and Hotep Lee. So if we look at sort of the basic structure of what our Q-type assumption looks like, and we plop it down into, let's say, the blue portion of a group in this framework, then we might have something like, okay, a random element R1 times A, R1 times A squared, R1 times A cubed, dot, 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 R1 times A to the cube. And a goal of this process might be to say that this Q-type assumption is similar to saying we want all of these things, even though they have this hidden structure of powers of A, we want them to look uniform and independently random. And that's sort of what a Q-type assumption does. But here we can sort of accomplish that same thing by using lots of subgroup decision steps. So if you imagine one of these subgroup decision problems that says I can't tell a blue element from a blue and red element, then if that problem is hard, it can allow me to sort of copy over any structure I have in blue over to something in red, because I take this unknown term that's either blue or blue and red, and I raise it to these structured exponents, and I don't know if I got this thing on the left-hand side or this thing on the right-hand side. So subgroup decision assumptions can be used to imply that these two distributions are computationally indistinguishable. And then we can notice something else about the structure of these groups, which is that I can set them up in such a way that their moduli are separate primes. Okay, so if this is in the mod P space and this is in the mod Q space, for P not equal to Q, then the Chinese remainder theorem says that if I take a random element modulo the product of these guys, and I look at R1 in the blue space as its mod P component, and R1 in the red space as its mod Q component, then those distributions are independent and uniformly random modulo P and modulo Q. So this really isn't a copy of this structure over here, it's got some fresh randomness. So it still has powers of the same thing. But that thing that it's powers of is completely unrelated to the A that it came from. And similarly, this random R1 in the front in the red space, we might as well give it a new name because it's completely uncorrelated from the mod P component in the blue space. Okay, so here I haven't actually done anything. I've just renamed things to point out the fact that their distribution is independent of the A mod P value and the R1 mod P value on the other side. And now we can keep doing this. So if we start from something that looks like this, that has an A structure and a B structure, we can keep doing this many times, and what ends up happening is the structure, we can keep making new copies of it, and it keeps additively contributing each time. So we can keep doing this, and then we get a new copy with a new parameter that we'll call B2, and so now we have powers of B1 plus powers of B2, and so on. And we can keep doing this with combinations of the Chinese remainder theorem and the subproposition assumptions to get a sum of Q different terms over here on the right-hand side. And so now where we used to have the powers of one element of A, here in this other space, yes?
Not the same Q, I assume.
Not the same Q. Excellent example of another collision in this talk. Yes, completely different Q. So this Q is like the number of terms in my Q-type assumption, and this Q is a prime that is independent. Yes? Other questions? See, I do that on purpose just to make sure you're paying attention.
It's why it's called the Jacques Q.
Yes, exactly. How many Qs do you? Yes. Excellent. I'm sure that's exactly how Sarah and Melissa intended it. Okay, so instead of having powers of one thing, we end up with sums of powers. Okay? And it's a sort of remarkable fact of linear algebra that sums of powers are distributed independently. So we can think of these terms now, these sums, as being generated by this following matrix product, where we take all the powers of B1 as a column and all the powers of BQ as a column. And now these Qs are the same Q. This is a square matrix. And we multiply this by these random coefficients, 2, 1 through 2Q. And the claim is that this is, as a vector, is uniformly random modulo Q, which is not the same Q, because this matrix is full rank. Okay, so this is a transpose of the random on matrix, and we know it is full rank. And that means that the distribution that we generate over here is going to be uniformly random. Okay? And from that, we can argue that after all of this work, we've gotten to something that's completely identically distributed to something uniformly random, at least in the red space. And then so when you actually use this in schemes, there's a little bit of a post-processing step where you have to use this extra randomness in the red space with another round of subgroup decision to bleed back into the blue space and destroy the structure that you're originally destroying in a more brute force way, which is the Q-type assumption. Okay. So this is a simulation technique that sort of allows us to take some things we used to be able to do with Q-type assumptions and sort of run this process under the hood and get them from subgroup decision assumptions that have a constant number of terms instead of a parameterized number of terms. Okay, you might have noticed here we're using the Chinese remainder theorem very heavily. And all these steps we're taking, all these powers of something are uncorrelated in one modulus compared to another modulus. It's sort of a very heavy use of the Chinese remainder theorem. And so when we try to simulate these things in prime order groups from SXDH, it's an open area of research to figure out essentially how to get something as powerful as that Chinese remainder theorem step from prime order groups. So we have some limited substitutes that work quite well for certain kinds of systems, but nothing as holistic and powerful as the Chinese remainder theorem. And so I'll show you a little bit about what the simulation of these subgroups using SXDH looks like. So this is not a picture that you can sort of concatenate, but it sort of gives you a sense of how we're thinking about the two sides of this problem. So if you're stuck with a prime order group, so there's only a blue space, there's not these other colors, then you can try to simulate this effect of different spaces using vectors in the exponent. So this technique has been used in many papers. Again, I should have had a cite here. This was initially coming from work of Akamoto and Takashima, I think as early as 2008. And so we can think about substituting for these kind of independent spaces by using two different dimensions in the exponent. So we're going to pick, let's say, two random vectors from a d-dimensional space over a prime field, and we can declare a sort of dual basis, b1 star and b2 star, such that whenever we take a dot product of bi times b star j, it's going to be 0 if these indices are not equal. So this is kind of how we're going to keep the red space from interacting with the blue space. We're going to make sure that red only interacts with red and blue only interacts with blue. And then we will have that, that the dot products of bi times bi star is equal to 1. So we do have red versus red interact, blue versus blue also interacts. And this now allows us to emulate some features of composite order asymmetric group. So we sort of had this picture that we wanted to look like this, where we have that the exponents in the blue space multiply and the exponents in the red space multiply. You can simulate that kind of effect here by taking G to this combination of vectors and pairing it against G to this combination of vectors. And now the cross dot products are 0. So you only get the sum of these two quadratic terms. So you emulate this kind of structure of these composite order groups. And you can sort of turn the subgroup decision problem into this XSCH problem by embedding these A and B into the definitions of these bases. So we can see here that if you define your bases in a certain way, then you can make it so that you can create these individual generators on one side, and you can create something here on the other side in one space, but not the other. So this is kind of equivalent to saying, all right, I can make red or blue on the other side, but I can't make something that would be only red, that would distinguish between having a red element or not. So from these kind of embeddings with XSPH, you can simulate some class of these subgroup decision assumptions. And the equivalent of the Chinese remainder theorem here turns out to be, or one limited equivalent, is that if I make this basis larger, let's say I have 6 dimensions or something, and I only give you some of them as generators from the public parameters, then I leave myself a degree of freedom of a change of basis matrix on the remaining guys that I can mind for making the randomness less correlated in these other spaces. So just to show you kind of how these things end up being used in proofs for systems, so the way these things usually end up is, let's say we're going to try to do a dual system proof for some kind of identity-based encryption or attribute-based encryption scheme. Then the way we usually do this is when we put the public parameters, let's say in the blue space, the ciphertext is generated from the public parameters, so it's also in the blue space. And secret keys might have this extra randomness in the green space on them, which won't get in the way of decryption, because when I pair ciphertext against key, only the blue survives. And I create these additional distributions of semi-functional keys in ciphertext, which go into this new red space. And that's going to help me explain why my simulator can create certain keys with certain properties. Because here, I have a space that's unconstrained by the public parameters. I have this independent source of randomness that the simulator can commit to later in the proof. And so this is how dual system proofs use this structure. And so far, for many of these schemes, like identity-based encryption, attribute-based encryption, and so on, this can be emulated well enough by the SXDH and decision linear transformations and dual pairing vector spaces. And I'll conclude by saying just a little bit about what we hope that this means for obfuscation. So in the high-level structure for how we might prove indistinguishability obfuscation, one of the main ideas is to have many parallel versions of the program running at once, each one being activated for different subsets of inputs. And so, and these subgroup decision assumptions are very much that same kind of structure where you have these sort of parallel tracks of computation happening in these different subgroups, and it can be used to sort of isolate different inputs as occurring in different programs. And so the structure of these things, I don't have time to go through the details, but the structure of these things for obfuscation can also line up with these kind of subgroup decision assumptions if we had them in multilinear groups. So I'll stop there.
Questions?
Yeah.
I have a philosophical question on what makes people uncomfortable with Q-type, or why Q-type is not entirely satisfactory. Like from a, it seems, if I understood correctly, not that different from in practice when we, like say, assume that a block cipher is like Q epsilon secure for Q queries, so it's kind of has this parameter that is varying in the assumption. So,
right.
I mean, other than sort of just wanting to have sort of minimize assumptions, is there something that's particularly worrying about the Q-type?
So the version, so these basic versions where you just have like powers of one thing. I don't think anyone is really like concerned that someone's going to break them anytime soon. But you can start to get more complicated versions of it's kind of more that the more of your, I mean, ultimately, right, we're trying to explain why does a certain attack translate into a certain problem. And having this degree of freedom of a Q-type assumption is sort of like having a degree of freedom of, you can encode more and more of the system into the assumption. And it starts to make us feel like we're actually missing insight about the structure of systems that we should be designing. Because I can, so we have, for attribute-based encryption, for instance, if we want to make our schemes really, really efficient, we end up with Q-type assumptions that don't just have powers of one thing. They have ratios of different pairs of things, and they start to encode more and more of what looks like a system into the assumption, and obviously it's a slippery slope.
Thanks.
Yes?
So I don't know if in your new life you followed the ever-changing landscape of obfuscation, but so right now, I mean, so your thing was like the first to kind of reduce it to some kind of Q-type, but like something which you can write in less than like 7
So
pages.
it's not Q-type. It's no. It's better than that. So this thing that I showed you, and I'll let you ask your question. I just want to. This thing that I showed you with the purple, it is this.
Right.
It's just this
so the
scale.
application, I see. So your application application also use something with like it's not even Q-type. You're saying it's just composite groups, but.
It's the degree of it's parameterized by the degree of multilinearity of the group, which is the length of the branching parameter.
Right. So I mean,
yeah.
it means still something.
It has a parameter. Yeah. But it looks like this.
So but right now, like Rachel et al., they kind of reduced it to like 5 to even 3 multilinear maps and shifted the complexity to like things that people like in complexity like random generators.
Right.
So how do you those things compare? Is it still a promising direction given that, or I mean, how do you put them in perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're both interesting and in some sense incomparable. I mean, I think having as many directions on this as we can is obviously good. I mean, personally, I find this kind of interesting too in just that, I guess the question that I've been thinking about more these days, instead of trying to keep up to date with the obfuscation for all functions and what is the minimal assumption class, it's just like, what's interesting about this to me is like, we have many ways of obfuscating a point function. We can do it from hashes, we can do it from subset sum, we can do it from, many LWE. And as we grow that, we have the Kennedy et al. Result from like a strong DDH variant that we can obfuscate a hyperplane from some version of that. I think an interesting question is, do bilinear maps help in obfuscation compared to linear groups. Like we sort of see, and I think this line of work is super interesting to see like what's the minimal to this, because we're coming at it from the opposite direction. What is the minimal degree of multilinearity that helps get a broader class of obfuscation? But I find it personally very implausible to imagine that there's nothing at the bilinear level. Like I don't really expect, I think someday I would bet you will have general obfuscation from LWE. I don't think we'll have it from bilinear maps. I think there are structural, like very clear structural limitations. But certainly also in the functional encryption domain, I mean, just the abstract question of what is the space of systems that can be built from bilinear maps, or what is the hierarchy of functionality that can be instantiated at 1 linear, 2 linear, 3 linear, 4 linear. We're very far from the systematic sort of algebraic geometry answer to that question. And to me, the sort of little piece that I like chipping away at it these days is, what can bilinear maps obfuscate that 1 linear maps can't, which is hopefully a distinct question from the attempt to get all, or it might at least be easily to partially answer than the attempt to get all.
But again, what you're saying, if I understand correctly, that you're saying there is like a qualitatively different thing whether you use multilinear maps, functionality of multilinear maps, or Q-type assumption, which could work even with bilinear maps, and in fact it historically first worked there. So you're kind of saying maybe another avenue would like still look at bilinear thing, but rather than only like doing SXDH or something, like get back to Q things, maybe there is some.
But it's interesting because even a Q-type assumption, when I look at it and I have all these powers of A in the exponent, I understand philosophically how that allows me to partition key spaces for IDE. Like I understand philosophically how that parameter helps me. But if you look at that, it's still the case, right, that structure of the Q-type assumption is something that you can't, if I give you all those elements, obviously it's true, right, that you can't brute force out detect that structure. Whereas obfuscation, if we think about these sort of branching programs, I'm giving you the ability to evaluate the function everywhere. So in some sense, I'm hiding a structure that you can brute force if you knew where to look, which is much more of a subset sum kind of flavor. Like the structure is detectable, but you don't know where to look. Q-type assumptions, I don't have a philosophy, which I think it's interesting, but like I don't have a philosophy for how a hidden but not evaluatable functionality is going to help for obfuscation. Like it's a different beast, it seems. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Any musings on plausibility of finding candidates for trilinear and above?
No.
All right. On that note, let's thank Allison and all the speakers of the workshop.
The week before.